In the depths of Gotham City, beneath the weight of countless shadows, and the echo of 1,000 crimes solved, and 1,000 more yet to come, there lived a man who had already lost one son to the world above. Bruce Wayne had watched Dick Grayson grow from a grieving circus child into something magnificent and independent. Watched him spread wings that no longer needed the shelter of the cave or the guidance of a father figure wrapped in darkness. The first Robin had become Nightwing, had found his own city to protect, his own path to walk, and while Bruce felt pride in what Dick had become, the cave felt impossibly empty without the sound of younger footsteps echoing through its chambers. Batman had always been a creature of solitude, born from tragedy and shaped by the need to ensure no other child would suffer as he had suffered. No other family would be torn apart in the mouth of a dirty alley, while the city looked away. But the years with Dick had changed something fundamental in the man beneath the cowl. There had been laughter in the cave, questions that forced him to explain not just the how of what they did, but the why. There had been someone to worry about, someone whose safety mattered more than his own, someone who could look at the darkness of Gotham and still find reasons to smile. Now the cave held only the sound of his own breathing, the distant drip of water from limestone formations that had watched over Gotham long before the first Wayne had set foot on its soil. The computer screens cast their cold blue light across empty spaces where a smaller figure had once stood, studying case files and asking the questions that kept Bruce grounded in something resembling humanity. The training equipment stood silent, the parallel bars and gymnastics rings that had once filled the air with the sounds of practice now gathering dust in the perpetual twilight of the underground world he had built. It was in this loneliness, this vast echoing silence, that Bruce Wayne made a decision that would haunt him for decades to come. He would find another partner, another Robin, another young soul who needed saving as much as Gotham needed protecting. He told himself it was practical, that Batman worked better with someone to watch his back, someone smaller who could fit through windows he could not, someone whose presence reminded him that there was still innocence in the world worth protecting. But in the quiet moments between patrol and dawn, in the space between removing the cowl and trying to find sleep, he knew the truth was simpler and more complicated than tactical advantage. Bruce Wayne was afraid of becoming the very darkness he fought against, afraid that without someone to protect, someone to guide, someone to care about more than himself, he would lose the last threads that connected him to the light. He had seen what happened to men who fought monsters too long, without anchor or purpose beyond the fight itself. They became the very thing they had set out to destroy, and Gotham had enough monsters already. So he began to look, to listen, to pay attention to the stories that filtered up from the streets, about children who had fallen through the cracks, young souls who survived on wit and desperation in the spaces between Gotham's official protection and its criminal underworld. He was looking for someone who needed Batman as much as Batman needed them, someone who could be saved and who could, in turn, save him from the consuming darkness that threatened to swallow everything good he had ever tried to be. He found that someone on a night when the autumn air carried the first real bite of winter, when the shadows seemed deeper and the city's heartbeat seemed slower, more laboured. Crime Alley, that stretch of Gotham that had taken his parents and shaped his destiny, had become a place he visited like a shrine, walking the same path his family had walked on that last night together, standing in the spot where everything had changed. It was ritual, it was penance, it was the closest thing to prayer that Bruce Wayne allowed himself. The Batmobile sat parked in the deeper shadows of the alley, its armoured bulk hidden from casual observation, but not, apparently, from the notice of someone small and desperate enough to see opportunity where others saw only danger. Bruce was standing at the mouth of the alley, lost in memory and the weight of years, when he heard the soft scrape of metal on metal, the careful whisper of someone trying very hard not to be heard. He turned to find a boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, crouched beside the Batmobile, with a tire iron in his hands and one of the car's wheels already half removed. The child was thin in the way that spoke of too many missed meals, dressed in clothes that had seen better years and better owners, his dark hair falling across his face as he worked with the focused intensity of someone for whom success meant the difference between eating and going hungry for another day. There was something in the boy's posture, something in the set of his shoulders and the careful way he moved, that spoke of intelligence and determination rather than simple desperation. This was not random vandalism or thoughtless destruction. This was survival, calculated and careful, and there was something almost admirable in the sheer audacity of attempting to steal the tires off Batman's car in the very alley where Batman's story had begun. Bruce watched from the shadows as the boy worked, noting the efficiency of his movements, the way he kept glancing around for signs of danger, the careful placement of his escape routes. This was someone who had learned to think several steps ahead, someone who understood that in Gotham's darkest corners, preparation and quick thinking were the only things that stood between survival and disaster. When the boy finally noticed him, there was no panic, no immediate flight. Instead, the child straightened slowly, tire iron still in hand, and met Bruce's gaze with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. There was wariness there, and calculation, but also something that might have been defiance, a refusal to apologize for doing what needed to be done to survive in a city that had clearly not made survival easy. The boy's name was Jason Todd, and his story was written in the scars on his knuckles and the careful way he held himself, always ready to run or fight depending on which option offered better odds. He had been born in the Bowery, in the kind of tenement building where the walls were thin and the heat worked only when the landlord remembered to pay the gas bill, where children learned early that the world was not a kind place, and that kindness, when it came, usually had a price attached. His father, Willis Todd, had been a small-time criminal, the sort of man who robbed convenience stores and stole cars not out of any grand ambition, but because he lacked the imagination or the courage for honest work. Willis had been the kind of father who disappeared for weeks at a time, leaving behind empty promises and emptier cupboards, who showed affection through stolen gifts and taught his son that the world was divided into those who took and those who got taken from. Jason's mother, Catherine, had loved her son fiercely, but had loved the needle more, finding in heroin the escape from a life that offered few other options for someone born poor in Gotham City. She had tried in her way to shield Jason from the worst of their life, to maintain some semblance of normalcy in their small apartment. But addiction was a stronger force than maternal instinct, and Jason had learned early to take care of himself. The streets had been Jason's real education, teaching him lessons that no school could provide about reading people's intentions, about finding food and shelter and safety in a city that seemed designed to chew up children and spit out their bones. He had learned to move quietly through shadows, to spot trouble before it spotted him, to take what he needed without getting caught, and when catching was inevitable, to fight hard enough and dirty enough that next time people might decide he was more trouble than he was worth. Crime Alley had been his territory, the place where he felt most at home, among the forgotten and the desperate, where his skills were most valuable and his reputation most solid. He knew every hiding place, every escape route, every shopkeeper who might spare a sandwich, and every cop who might look the other way. It was a hard life, but it was his life, and he had made it work through sheer determination and the kind of street wisdom that kept children alive in places where childhood was a luxury few could afford. Jason had been stealing the tires off the Batmobile not out of desperation, but out of defiance. A 13-year-old boy who had spotted the most famous car in Gotham City parked in his territory and decided that even Batman was not exempt from the rules of Crime Alley. He had worked quietly in the darkness, his small hands quick and sure with the tire iron he had lifted from an abandoned garage weeks earlier, when the shadow had fallen across him and a voice had spoken from the darkness above. Most children would have run, but Jason Todd had never been most children, and when Batman had dropped down beside him, Jason had swung the tire iron with the kind of practiced violence that spoke of too many nights when violence had been the only thing standing between him and worse fates. Batman had caught the iron easily, almost gently, and in that moment something had shifted in the darkness of Crime Alley, though neither of them would understand what until much later. The conversation that followed had been brief and strange, a masked vigilante and a street child talking in the shadows, while Gotham carried on its nightly business around them. And when Batman had offered Jason food instead of arrest, the boy had accepted with the wariness of someone who had learned that gifts always came with strings attached. The meal had led to questions, and the questions had led to stories, and the stories had revealed a child who was angry and brilliant and utterly alone in a city that had never shown him anything but cruelty. Batman had seen something in Jason Todd that night, perhaps a reflection of his own rage, perhaps a reminder of the boy he himself had once been. And when he had made the offer that would change both their lives forever, Jason had said yes, not because he trusted Bruce Wayne, but because he had nowhere else to go. The transition from Crime Alley to Wayne Manor had been jarring in ways that Alfred Pennyworth's gentle ministrations could not entirely smooth. A boy accustomed to sleeping with one eye open, suddenly finding himself in a bed larger than his old apartment, surrounded by more food than he had seen in his entire life, and people who seemed genuinely interested in his welfare without wanting anything obvious in return. Jason had tested every boundary, pushed against every kindness, waiting for the moment when the mask would slip and he would discover what Bruce Wayne really wanted from him. But that moment had never come, or at least not in the way he had expected. Instead, he had found himself in the cave, staring at the costume that had belonged to Dick Grayson, the first Robin who had outgrown the role and moved on to become something else, something independent, leaving behind a legacy that felt both inspiring and impossible to match. Bruce had explained the mission, the war against crime that consumed his nights and defined his existence, and Jason had understood immediately that this was not a game or a fantasy, but something deadly serious, a crusade that demanded everything from those who chose to join it. The training had been intense and unforgiving, months of learning not just how to fight, but how to think like a detective, how to read crime scenes and analyze evidence, how to move through the darkness like a ghost and strike fear into the hearts of men who thought they were beyond justice. Jason had thrown himself into the work with the same fierce determination that had kept him alive on the streets, but he had brought something else to the role as well, something that Dick Grayson had never possessed, a deep burning anger at the injustices of the world and a willingness to cross lines that his predecessor had always carefully observed. As Robin, Jason Todd had been different from his predecessor in ways that both helped and hindered the mission, bringing a street-smart cynicism and a dark humour that made him effective in situations where Dick's more optimistic approach might have failed, but also carrying a rage that sometimes threatened to overwhelm his judgment and lead him down paths that Batman could not follow. He had been quicker to use force, more willing to hurt criminals who seemed to deserve it, less concerned with the fine distinctions between justice and revenge that formed the core of Batman's moral code. The cases they had worked together had been successful, more often than not, Jason's insights into the criminal mind proving invaluable in investigations that might have stalled without his particular understanding of how desperation and greed motivated the people they pursued. He had been particularly effective against drug dealers and human traffickers, criminals whose work reminded him too much of his own childhood and his mother's struggles. And there had been nights when Batman had to physically restrain his young partner from going too far in his pursuit of what he saw as justice. The arguments between them had grown more frequent as Jason matured, philosophical debates that carried the weight of their different experiences and different views of what their mission should accomplish. Jason had never understood why they spent so much effort capturing criminals who would inevitably escape from Arkham or Blackgate, why they worked so hard to preserve a system that had failed people like his mother and would fail countless others, why mercy was extended to those who had never shown mercy to their victims. Batman had tried to explain the importance of maintaining moral boundaries, of being better than the criminals they fought, but Jason had seen too much of the world's cruelty to accept that explanation easily, and their relationship had begun to show the strain of their fundamental disagreements about the nature of justice and the price of maintaining one's soul in a war against evil. The search for his birth mother had begun with a discovery that shattered Jason's understanding of his own past, documents that suggested Catherine Todd had not been his biological mother, but rather a stepmother who had raised him as her own, and that his real mother was still alive somewhere in the world, waiting to be found. The trail had led them out of Gotham for the first time since Jason had become Robin, following leads across continents to places where the reach of Batman's reputation was less certain and the rules that governed their mission less clear. Each potential mother they investigated had brought new hope and new disappointment. Women who had known Willis Todd but had never borne his child. Women who had given birth decades too early or too late. Women who had died before Jason was born, or who had never left the cities where they claimed to have met his father. The investigation had become an obsession for Jason, a chance to understand where he had come from, and perhaps to find some piece of family that had not been destroyed by addiction or crime or the casual cruelties of poverty. Batman had supported the search, understanding how important it was for his young partner to have answers to the questions that had haunted him since childhood. But there had been something troubling about Jason's intensity during those months, a desperation that suggested he was looking for more than just information about his past. The trail had finally led them to Ethiopia, to a woman named Sheila Haywood, who was working as a doctor in a refugee camp, providing medical care to people displaced by war and famine. And when Jason had seen her photograph, he had been certain that he had found what he had been looking for, the missing piece that would make sense of his life, and perhaps provide the family connection he had never really had. The refugee camp where Sheila Haywood worked stretched across the dusty Ethiopian landscape, like a temporary city built from canvas and hope, filled with people who had fled violence and drought in search of safety that seemed always just beyond reach. Batman had insisted they approach the situation carefully, understanding that revealing Jason's identity as Robin could put both the doctor and the refugees at risk. But Jason had been eager to meet the woman who might be his mother, his excitement barely contained as they made their way through the makeshift streets between the tents. Dr. Haywood had been exactly what Jason had hoped to find, a woman dedicated to helping others despite the dangerous conditions, someone who seemed to embody the kind of goodness that his stepmother Catherine had possessed before addiction had consumed her life. The initial meeting had gone well, with Sheila confirming that she had indeed known Willis Todd years earlier, though she had been careful not to reveal too much about their relationship, or about Jason's parentage, claiming she needed time to process the unexpected reunion with the son she had never known she would see again. Batman had sensed something troubling in her hesitation, a careful quality to her words that suggested she was hiding more than just maternal emotions, but Jason had been so thrilled to finally have answers about his origins that he had missed the subtle signs of deception that his training should have taught him to recognize. The Joker's presence in Ethiopia had been the first sign that their mission was about to take a darker turn, though neither Batman nor Robin had initially understood the connection between the clown prince of crime and the refugee camp where Jason's mother was working. The Joker had been running one of his elaborate schemes, using his twisted genius to manipulate international relief efforts for his own profit, stealing medical supplies that were meant to save lives and selling them to the highest bidder, while people suffered and died without the care they desperately needed. Dr. Hayward had been caught in the middle of this operation, threatened and coerced into cooperation by a madman who found the suffering of refugees amusing, forced to choose between her own safety and the welfare of the people she had dedicated her life to protecting. When Jason had learned about his mother's involvement with the Joker, he had been devastated by what seemed like another betrayal by someone he had trusted, another adult who had chosen criminality over the safety of innocent people, and his anger had overwhelmed his judgment in ways that would prove fatal. Batman had tried to convince Jason to wait, to approach the situation with the careful planning that had kept them alive through countless dangerous encounters. But Jason's emotional investment in the outcome had made patience impossible, and he had insisted on confronting his mother immediately to demand answers about her choices and her loyalty. The warehouse where Dr. Hayward had agreed to meet Jason had been one of the Joker's temporary bases, a building that should have felt wrong to anyone with Robin's training, but Jason's desperate need for resolution had overridden his instincts for danger. Sheila Hayward had revealed the full extent of her complicity with the Joker's scheme, explaining how she had been embezzling medical supplies long before the clown's arrival, using her position to enrich herself while refugees died from treatable conditions, and how the Joker had simply taken advantage of her existing corruption rather than creating it from nothing. The revelation had shattered Jason's last hope for finding family that lived up to his ideals, confirming his growing belief that the world was fundamentally corrupt, and that even those who appeared to be heroes were often motivated by greed and selfishness. When the Joker had appeared with his crowbar and his terrible grin, Jason had been too emotionally devastated to fight with his usual skill, too heartbroken by his mother's betrayal to focus on the immediate physical danger that threatened his life. The beating that followed had been methodical and cruel, the Joker's laughter echoing through the warehouse as he systematically broke the young hero who had dared to interfere with his plans, while Sheila Hayward watched in horror at what her choices had brought about. Batman had been racing across the Ethiopian countryside when the explosion lit up the night sky, the warehouse disappearing in a ball of flame that could be seen for miles across the desert landscape. The Joker had left nothing to chance, rigging the building with enough explosives to ensure that no evidence of his crimes would survive, and no witnesses would remain to testify about what had happened in those final moments. When Batman had arrived at the smoking ruins, he had found Jason's broken body in the rubble, his young partner's costume torn and bloodied but still recognizable, still bearing the symbol that had represented hope and justice in the darkest corners of Gotham. The flight back to Gotham had been the longest journey of Batman's life, carrying the boy who had tried so hard to prove himself worthy of the Robin name. The child who'd stolen the tires off the Batmobile and had somehow stolen Bruce Wayne's heart in the process. Alfred had been waiting in the cave when they returned, his face grave with the knowledge that their family had been diminished by one, that the boy who had brought laughter and irreverence to their mission would never again challenge Batman's methods or argue about the proper way to handle criminals. The memorial case that Batman had installed in the cave had become a shrine to his failure. Jason's Robin costume displayed behind bulletproof glass with a plaque that bore the simple inscription that would haunt Bruce Wayne for years to come. The uniform had remained exactly as it had been on that final night, torn and stained with evidence of the Joker's cruelty, a constant reminder of what happened when Batman's war against crime claimed the life of someone he had sworn to protect. Visitors to the cave had found the memorial disturbing, a morbid display that seemed designed more to torture Batman than to honor Jason's memory. But Bruce had refused all suggestions that the costume be cleaned or repaired or moved to a less prominent location. The sight of Jason's empty uniform had served as a daily reminder of the price of failure in their war against evil, a visual representation of why Batman could never allow himself to become careless or overconfident in his mission to protect Gotham from the criminals who would destroy it given the chance. The years following Jason's death had been marked by a fundamental change in Batman's approach to crime fighting, a harder edge that had made him more effective against criminals but had also made him more isolated from the people who cared about him. Gotham had felt the change in its protector almost immediately, as Batman's methods had become more aggressive and his tolerance for criminal behavior had essentially disappeared. The criminals who had once expected to survive their encounters with the Dark Knight had found themselves facing a man who seemed to have lost interest in showing mercy or restraint, someone who would use whatever force was necessary to ensure that justice was served regardless of the cost, to himself or others. Police Commissioner Gordon had noticed the difference during their rooftop meetings. The way Batman's voice had become colder, and his responses to questions more clipped and distant, as though he was speaking from behind a wall that had not existed before Jason's death. The other heroes who worked with Batman had found him increasingly difficult to partner with, his unwillingness to trust or delegate responsibility making collaboration nearly impossible, and his tendency to work alone had become more pronounced as the months had turned into years. Even Alfred had struggled to reach the man who had become more machine than human in his pursuit of criminals, someone who seemed to have forgotten that Bruce Wayne had ever existed beneath the cowl and cape that had become his entire identity. The reality-altering punch that had brought Jason Todd back to life had been delivered by Superboy Prime during one of the cosmic crises that periodically threatened the entire multiverse, a blow so powerful that it had shattered the barriers between life and death and had restored breath to a body that had been buried for months. Jason had awakened in his own coffin, clawing his way through 6 feet of earth with fingernails that had torn away to nothing, emerging from his grave like something from a nightmare, confused and terrified and unable to understand how he had returned to a world that had buried him. The months that had followed his resurrection had been a blur of confusion and pain, as Jason had wandered the streets of Gotham like a ghost, his mind damaged by the trauma of death and resurrection, his memories fragmentary and unreliable, his understanding of his own identity uncertain and constantly shifting. The Talia al Ghul who had found him during those lost months had recognized something in the broken young man who moved through Gotham's shadows like a wounded animal, though it had taken her considerable time to piece together who he truly was and what had happened to bring him back from the dead. She had watched him from a distance at first, noting the way he moved with the trained reflexes of someone who had been taught to fight by the best, the way his eyes tracked movement and assessed threats with an unconscious competence that spoke of years of careful instruction. When she had finally approached him, Jason had been living rough in the abandoned buildings and forgotten corners of the city, surviving on instinct and muscle memory, his mind still too fractured to fully comprehend his situation or remember the details of his former life. Talia had taken him away from Gotham then, bringing him to one of her father's hidden strongholds, where the Lazarus Pit waited like a pool of green fire, its mystical waters promising healing and restoration at a price that few who entered its depths ever fully understood. The immersion in the Lazarus pit had restored Jason's memories and healed the damage that death and resurrection had done to his mind. But it had also filled him with something else, a rage so pure and consuming that it had threatened to burn away everything that remained of the boy who had once worn the Robin costume with such pride and determination. The pit's influence had amplified every anger and frustration that Jason had ever felt, every moment of doubt about Batman's methods, every question about whether the mission they had shared had been worth the sacrifice it had demanded. The memories that had returned to him had been filtered through this new lens of fury, transforming moments of partnership and family into evidence of manipulation and betrayal, turning Batman's teachings about justice and restraint into proof of weakness and hypocrisy. Talia had provided him with training during the years that had followed, connecting him with masters of combat and strategy from across the globe, men and women who had taught him skills that Batman had never shared, methods that the Dark Knight would never have approved of or condoned. The Jason Todd who had eventually returned to Gotham had been transformed by his journey through death and resurrection, by the Lazarus pit's corruption, and by years of training that had emphasized results over methods, victory over principle. He had chosen the name Red Hood as both a challenge and an insult, taking the identity that the Joker had worn during his own transformation from failed comedian to agent of chaos, reclaiming it as a symbol of someone who was willing to do what Batman would not. The criminal empire that Jason had built upon his return had been methodical and ruthless, designed not just to control Gotham's drug trade, but to force a confrontation with the man who had trained him, to make Batman face the consequences of his unwillingness to cross the lines that Jason now crossed without hesitation. He had eliminated the competition through methods that left no room for survival or second chances, taking over territories that had been contested for years through a combination of superior tactics and absolute brutality. Black Mask had found himself caught between two forces that he could not fully comprehend or control: his own criminal organization, squeezed by Jason's expansion and Batman's investigation, both of which had seemed to accelerate beyond anything he had previously experienced in his years of operating in Gotham's underworld. The meetings between Batman and the Red Hood had taken place on rooftops and in abandoned buildings throughout the city, conversations that had been part negotiation and part interrogation, each man trying to understand what the other had become in the years since Jason's death. Batman had recognized his former partner despite the mask and the changed voice, despite the years and the transformation that death and resurrection had wrought, but the recognition had brought no relief or joy, only a deeper understanding of how completely he had failed the boy he had sworn to protect and guide. The question that Jason had asked repeatedly during these encounters had been simple and devastating in its directness, cutting through every justification and rationalization that Batman had constructed around his mission and his methods. Why was the Joker still alive when he had murdered Robin, when he'd taken a crowbar to a 15-year-old boy and then set off a bomb to ensure that no help could arrive in time to save him? Why had Batman allowed the man responsible for Jason's death to continue breathing, to continue killing, to continue spreading chaos and pain throughout Gotham when a single bullet or a moment of decisive action could have ended his reign of terror forever? The answer that Batman had given about justice and law and the importance of not becoming the criminals they fought had sounded hollow, even to his own ears when spoken to the living proof of what his restraint had cost. The final confrontation had taken place in the same warehouse district where Jason had died, among the shadows and abandoned buildings that had witnessed his transformation from street orphan to Robin to victim to something altogether new and dangerous. Batman had arrived to find the Joker bound and helpless, with Jason standing over him, holding both a gun and a crowbar, the weapons representing two different paths forward, two different answers to the question of what justice truly meant. The choice that Jason had offered had been elegantly simple in its cruelty, forcing Batman to either kill the Joker himself or watch as Jason did what Batman had never been willing to do, making the Dark Knight complicit in murder either through action or inaction. The moments that had followed had stretched like hours, three figures frozen in a tableau that represented everything that was broken about their relationship, everything that could never be repaired or forgotten. Batman's answer had come not in words but in action, the batarang that had knocked the gun from Jason's hand, arriving at the same moment that the Joker had triggered the explosive device he had somehow managed to reach despite his bonds. The warehouse had collapsed around them in a thunder of concrete and steel, and when the dust had settled and the rescue teams had finished their work, both Jason and the Joker had vanished, leaving Batman alone among the ruins to contemplate the weight of choices made and unmade. The years that had followed had been marked by an uneasy dance between father and son, moments when Jason had worked alongside the Bat family, alternating with periods when he had operated entirely outside their influence, his methods and his mission sometimes aligning with theirs and sometimes directly opposing everything they represented. The Outlaws had given Jason something that he had not possessed since his resurrection, a team of damaged individuals who understood the necessity of crossing lines that traditional heroes would not cross, who shared his willingness to kill when killing was the most effective solution to a problem that threatened innocent lives. Through his work with Arsenal and Starfire and the others who had joined their cause, Jason had found a way to channel his rage into something that resembled heroism, even if it was a darker and more pragmatic version than Batman would ever approve of or endorse. The missions they had undertaken together had taken them across the globe and beyond, fighting threats that required the kind of permanent solutions that Jason specialized in providing, building a reputation as heroes who could be counted on to finish what they started regardless of the cost. The relationship between Batman and Jason had evolved slowly over the years, marked by moments of genuine connection and understanding, alternating with periods of mistrust and conflict. Neither man able to fully forgive or forget what had happened between them, but both gradually learning to accept that they had become different people than they had been before Jason's death and resurrection. There had been times when Jason had returned to the cave as a member of the family, working cases with Tim Drake and Damian Wayne and Dick Grayson, falling back into patterns of partnership and cooperation that had felt almost natural despite everything that had changed. There had been other times when his methods had put him at odds with everything the Bat family represented, when his willingness to kill had made him an enemy rather than an ally, when Batman had been forced to choose between his principles and his son. The meaning of Batman's greatest failure had never been as simple as the death of Robin, though that tragedy had certainly been the catalyst for everything that had followed. The real failure had been deeper and more complex, rooted in Bruce Wayne's inability to see that taking children into his war against crime would inevitably lead to consequences that he was not prepared to face or accept. Jason Todd had become the living embodiment of that failure, a reminder that good intentions and careful training were not always enough to protect the people you loved from the dangers that surrounded them, that sometimes the very act of trying to save someone could lead to their destruction in ways that no amount of preparation or precaution could prevent. The years that had followed Jason's return had been marked by a gradual understanding between father and son that their relationship would never be what it had been before, that the boy who had stolen the tires from the Batmobile in Crime Alley and the man who had emerged from the Lazarus pit were connected by memory and blood, but separated by experiences that could not be undone or forgotten. Bruce had learned to accept that Jason's methods would always be more extreme than his own, that the second Robin had been fundamentally changed by his death and resurrection in ways that made it impossible for him to return to the idealistic heroism of his youth. Jason had learned to accept that Batman's refusal to kill would always stand between them, that his father's moral code was not a weakness or a failure of will, but a fundamental part of who Bruce Wayne had chosen to become in response to his own childhood trauma. The conversations they had shared in the cave during the quiet moments between cases had been careful and measured, both men aware that certain topics remained too painful or contentious to explore fully, but both gradually building a new foundation of mutual respect and understanding that acknowledged their differences without trying to eliminate them entirely. The other members of the Bat family had each developed their own relationships with Jason over time, creating a complex web of connections that reflected the unique position he occupied within their extended family structure. Dick Grayson had been the first to truly welcome Jason back, perhaps because he understood better than anyone else what it meant to be Robin and then to become something else entirely, to carry the weight of Batman's expectations and then to forge your own path in the world. Tim Drake had been more cautious in his acceptance, having lived through the years when Jason's death had cast a shadow over everything the family did, but had eventually come to appreciate Jason's experience and tactical skills, even when he disagreed with his methods. Damian Wayne had formed perhaps the most complicated relationship with Jason, seeing in him both a cautionary tale about the dangers of disappointing Batman and a model for how to maintain your own identity while operating within the family's moral framework. The missions that had brought Jason back into Batman's orbit had often involved threats that required the kind of permanent solutions that the rest of the family was unwilling or unable to provide, situations where Jason's willingness to cross certain lines made him uniquely qualified to handle problems that might otherwise have festered and grown into larger dangers. These collaborations had been marked by careful planning and clear communication, with Batman and Jason establishing boundaries and protocols that allowed them to work together effectively while acknowledging their fundamental philosophical differences. The success of these joint operations had gradually rebuilt a measure of trust between them, though it was a different kind of trust than had existed between Batman and the teenage Robin, who had once followed his orders without question or hesitation. The criminal underworld of Gotham had learned to fear Jason Todd in ways that were distinct from their fear of Batman, understanding that the Red Hood represented a different kind of justice that was final and absolute in its application. The drug dealers and human traffickers, who had once operated with impunity in the knowledge that Batman would capture them but not kill them, had found themselves facing an opponent who was willing to eliminate threats permanently, who saw their deaths as a necessary step in protecting the innocent people they preyed upon. This reputation had created a strange dynamic within Gotham's criminal ecosystem, with some criminals avoiding certain types of crimes entirely out of fear of attracting Jason's attention, while others had begun targeting him specifically in attempts to eliminate what they saw as an existential threat to their operations. The relationship between Jason and the Joker had remained one of the most complex and painful aspects of his ongoing story, a wound that had never fully healed despite the passage of time and the evolution of Jason's character and methods. The Joker's continued existence served as a constant reminder of Batman's unwillingness to cross the ultimate line, even when that crossing might prevent future tragedies and save innocent lives. Jason had learned to live with this reality, but the anger and frustration it generated had never completely disappeared, surfacing during moments of particular stress, or when the Joker's actions had resulted in new victims who might have been saved if different choices had been made years earlier. The conversations between Batman and Jason about the Joker had become less frequent over time, but they had never stopped entirely, representing an ongoing philosophical divide that neither man seemed capable of bridging completely. The broader superhero community had gradually come to accept Jason Todd as a legitimate hero despite his unconventional methods, recognizing that his willingness to make hard choices and accept difficult consequences had made him an effective ally in situations where traditional heroic approaches had proven insufficient. His work with various teams and organizations had demonstrated his tactical skills and strategic thinking, qualities that had been enhanced rather than diminished by his experiences with death and resurrection. The relationships he had built with other heroes had been based on mutual respect and shared objectives rather than personal friendship, reflecting Jason's understanding that his methods would always set him apart from those who adhered to more traditional heroic codes. The evolution of Jason's relationship with his own past had been perhaps the most significant aspect of his long journey back from death and rage, as he had gradually learned to see his experiences not as a source of endless anger, but as a foundation for understanding and helping others who had faced similar tragedies and losses. His work with young people who had been failed by the system had become one of his most important ongoing commitments, using his own story as a way to connect with kids who had given up hope, or who were considering taking paths that would lead them into darkness and despair. These interactions had revealed aspects of Jason's character that had been buried under years of anger and violence, showing that the compassion and heroism that had originally drawn Batman's attention in Crime Alley had survived his death and resurrection, transformed but not destroyed by everything that had happened to him. The question of whether Batman's decision to take Jason Todd as his second Robin had been a mistake had become less relevant over time than the question of what that decision had revealed about Bruce Wayne's own needs and limitations as both a hero and a father figure. The tragedy of Jason's death had forced Batman to confront the reality that his war against crime would inevitably put the people he cared about in danger, that his desire to help and protect others could lead to consequences that he was not prepared to accept or bear. The lesson had been painful and expensive, paid for with the life of a boy who had deserved better than the fate that had befallen him, but it had also led to growth and understanding that had made Batman a more effective hero and a more thoughtful guardian of those who fought beside him. And so we come to the quiet truth at the heart of Jason Todd's story. Not just the tragedy of his death, nor the fury of his resurrection, but the slow, uneven reconciliation between who he was and who he became. The boy who once stole tires from the Batmobile in Crime Alley never truly vanished, even when the Red Hood's mask obscured his face. The anger that had burned so brightly in his return eventually settled into something more complex, a fire banked but never extinguished, warming him rather than consuming him. Gotham, too, had changed around him. The city that had once failed him now found itself watched over by a man who understood its darkest corners better than most. Jason moved through its streets not as a shadow like Batman, nor as a bright symbol like Dick Grayson's Robin, but as something in between, a protector who had seen the worst of what the world could do and still chose to stand against it, even if his methods remained his own. There were nights when he worked alongside the Bat family, though never quite as one of them. The trust between him and Bruce had been too fractured by blood and betrayal to ever fully mend, but time had dulled the sharpest edges of their conflict. They spoke less of Ethiopia, of crowbars and bombs, and more of the work, the criminals who needed stopping, the people who needed saving. It was an uneasy peace, but a peace nonetheless. And then there were the others, the lost ones, the broken ones, the young faces in Gotham's alleys who reminded him too much of himself. These were the ones Jason sought out quietly, without fanfare. He didn't offer them platitudes about justice or hope. He spoke to them in a language they understood: survival. He fed the hungry, sheltered the homeless, and sometimes, when they were ready, he gave them a choice: Not the same one Batman had given him, but one that acknowledged the harshness of their world. Some took it, some didn't. But none of them died in a warehouse because he wasn't fast enough to save them. The Joker, of course, still lived. That wound never fully closed. There were nights when Jason's fingers twitched toward a gun at the mere mention of the clown's name, when the old rage threatened to rise like a tide. But time had taught him something crucial. Killing the Joker wouldn't unbreak what had been broken. It wouldn't give him back the years he'd lost, wouldn't erase the pain Bruce had carried, wouldn't undo the fact that, for a long time, Gotham had been a city where Robin's laughter had gone silent. So he made his peace with the demon that haunted him. Not forgiveness, never that, but an understanding that some battles weren't meant to be won with bullets or blades. The Joker would always be Batman's burden to bear, and Jason had his own war to fight. In the end, the most surprising thing wasn't that Jason Todd had returned from the dead. It was that he had learned how to live again. Not as the boy he'd been, not as the weapon he'd become, but as something new. A man who carried his scars without letting them define him. A fighter who chose his battles instead of being consumed by them. A hero in his own way, even if he'd never call himself one. And on the rare nights when he allowed himself to look back, to remember the weight of a Robin's cape on his shoulders, the sound of Batman's voice saying, "Good work, partner," he no longer flinched. The memories didn't burn as they once had. They were just that, memories, proof that he had existed before the darkness, before the pit, before the hood, proof that for a little while at least, he had been happy. The Batcave still kept his uniform behind glass, a memorial to a tragedy. But Jason Todd was no longer a ghost. He was a man who walked in daylight as much as darkness, who had carved out a place for himself in the world, not as Batman's greatest failure, but as his own person. And perhaps that, more than anything else, was the real victory. The streets of Gotham never truly changed, not in any way that mattered. They were still slick with rain under flickering streetlights, still whispered with the echoes of old pain, still teemed with lost souls searching for something they couldn't name. But Jason moved through them differently now. He knew their rhythms, their secrets, the way a man knows the scars on his own hands. He had been one of those lost souls once, a boy with nothing but his fists and his fury to keep him warm. Now he walked those same alleys not as prey, not as a ghost, but as something else entirely. A shadow with teeth, yes, but also a man who remembered what it was to be hungry. There were still nights when he worked alone, cutting through Gotham's underbelly like a knife through rot. The Red Hood was a name that carried weight now. A legend whispered in the dark. Criminals feared it. The desperate sometimes reached for it. And Batman still watched. Their dance was an old one, a push and pull of trust and tension, but the edges had softened over time. There were even nights, rare, fragile things, when they fought side by side, falling into old rhythms without speaking. Jason would never admit how easily those movements came back to him. How natural it felt to have Batman at his back after all these years. But he knew Bruce noticed. Just as he knew Bruce would never mention it. Alfred had been the first to bridge the gap, of course. A cup of tea left on a rooftop where Jason often brooded. A dry remark about the state of his boots. Small, quiet gestures that said more than any grand apology ever could. Jason had scoffed at them at first, but he'd drunk the tea. And he'd come back for more. Dick had been harder. There was too much history there, too many unspoken resentments. The golden boy, the first Robin, the one who'd left and made space for Jason without ever meaning to. They'd circled each other for years. Two animals with the same scent but different wounds. But time and near-death experiences, Gotham provided plenty of those, had sanded down the sharpest edges. These days they could share a rooftop in silence, without it feeling like a threat. Sometimes they even joked. Jason's jokes were better. Dick's were more frequent. This was an unshakable law of the universe. And then there was Tim, the Robin who'd come after, the one who'd pieced together Batman's grief and stepped into the role before it destroyed him. Jason had hated him for that once. Hated how easy he made it look, how effortlessly he fit into a life that had nearly broken Jason in half. But hatred was a heavy thing to carry, and Jason had grown tired of the weight. These days, he and Tim had an understanding. They'd never be brothers, not the way Dick and Jason might have been under different stars, but they could be allies. Sometimes, when the night was particularly long, they could even be friends. Damien was Damien, a little demon in a robin suit, all arrogance and sharp edges. Jason would never admit it, but he liked the kid. There was something refreshing about his bluntness, his lack of pretense. And if Jason occasionally slipped him contraband snacks or taught him swear words in languages Alfred didn't know, well, that was just payback for all the headaches Bruce had given him over the years. The family was a fractured thing, but it was still a family. And Jason, against all odds, was part of it again. Not the way he'd been before, never that, but in a way that fit the man he'd become. He dropped by the manor sometimes when the mood struck him. He let Alfred fuss over his injuries. He traded barbs with Dick and tolerated Damien's glowering and pretended not to notice when Bruce left a file on the table with information Jason might find useful. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And then there were the outlaws. Roy and Corey, Artemis and Bizarro, the ones who'd stood beside him when he'd had no one else. They weren't replacements for what he'd lost. They were something new, something wilder and rougher around the edges, a team of misfits who'd chosen each other. Roy, with his quick hands and quicker mouth, his own demons nipping at his heels. Corey, bright and burning, a star who'd seen darkness of her own. They'd fought together, bled together, built something that wasn't Batman's way, but worked all the same. Jason had never been good at following orders. Leading, though, that came naturally. The missions weren't always clean, the lines weren't always clear, but they saved people. And for a long time, that had been enough. Then Roy died, and the world tilted. It wasn't the same as Ethiopia. It wasn't the same as a crowbar and a laugh and a bomb counting down. But loss was loss, and grief was grief, and Jason found himself standing over another grave, staring at another name, etched in stone, wondering how the hell he kept outliving everyone he cared about. He disappeared for a while after that, not out of guilt, not this time, but because some wounds needed solitude to heal. He'd travelled, letting the road take him where it would, until the sharp edges of his pain had dulled enough to carry. When he came back, he was quieter, not softer. Never that, but more deliberate. The fire was still there, but it burned lower, steadier. Gotham welcomed him back like an old lover, with open arms and hidden knives. The streets remembered him. The criminals still flinched at his name. And Batman, ever watchful, gave him the space he needed. They'd come to an understanding, after all these years. Bruce would never approve of Jason's methods. Jason would never ask him to. But they could share a city. They could share a purpose. And on the darkest nights, when the weight of the past threatened to crush them both, they could share a silence that meant more than words ever could. Jason Todd had died. Jason Todd had come back. And in between those two truths, he'd built a life, not the one he'd imagined as a wide-eyed kid in a robin suit, but one that fit him all the same. The memorial case in the Batcave still stood. The suit behind the glass still waited. But Jason didn't visit it often. He didn't need to. He was alive, and that, in the end, was the only revenge that mattered. The rain fell softly over Gotham, the same as it always had. The city breathed in the dark, its heart beating steady, beneath the weight of its own history. And somewhere above it all, on a rooftop, slick with damp, a man in a red hood watched over the streets that had made him. Not as a ghost, not as a cautionary tale, but as something far more dangerous, a man who had learned, against all odds, how to live. The night stretched on, and Jason Todd, at last, was at peace. Gotham never slept, not truly. Even in the quietest hours, when the neon bled into fog and the alleys held their breath, there was always movement. A drug deal in the shadows, a cat burglar scaling a fire escape, the distant wail of a siren like a wounded animal calling into the dark. Jason knew these sounds the way a sailor knew the sea. They were the rhythm of the city, the pulse of the life he'd chosen, or maybe the life that had chosen him. He thought about that sometimes, leaning against a gargoyle's weathered wings, the cold stone biting through his jacket. How much of who he was had been decided for him long before he ever stole those Batmobile tires, his father's fists, his mother's needles, the alley where he'd learned that the world was cruel long before he ever met the clown who'd prove it. But he didn't dwell on it. Not anymore. The past was a knife, useful in a fight, but only if you knew when to put it down. So he patrolled. Not like Batman, with his strict codes and his no-kill rule, but not like the mercenary he'd once been either. He picked his battles now, stopped the worst of the worst, left the rest to the bats. It was a compromise, and Jason had never been good at those, but time had a way of sanding down to even the sharpest edges. Then there were the rare nights when he wasn't alone, when a shadow would drop onto the rooftop beside him, and for a moment, just a moment, they were just two men looking out over a city that had taken so much from them both. "You're late," Jason would say, not turning his head. Bruce would grunt, the way he always did when he didn't want to admit Jason was right. Had a lead on the False Face Society? And dead end, Jason would smirk. Sounds like you need my contacts. Another grunt. This one meant maybe. They never talked about Ethiopia, never talked about the crowbar, or the bomb, or the years Jason spent dead. But sometimes, when the wind was just right, and the night was just still enough, Bruce would look at him, really look at him, and Jason would see it. The guilt, the grief, the quiet, unbearable relief. It was enough. Then the moment would pass and they'd go back to pretending they weren't family. The cave was different now. Not in any way most people would notice. The same stalactites, the same trophies, the same faint smell of damp and diesel, but Jason could feel it. The weight of absence. Dick was off with the Titans. Tim was wherever Tim was these days. Damien was busy being the heir to the demon or whatever the hell he called it. And Bruce still worked, still fought, still carried the weight of Gotham, like Atlas, with the world on his shoulders. But he was slower now. Not in body, not yet, but in spirit. The years had carved lines into his face that even the cowl couldn't hide. Jason wondered sometimes if Bruce realised. If he knew how much of himself he'd given away to the city, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left but the mission. Then again, maybe that was the point. Jason didn't visit the cave often, too many ghosts, but when he did, he always stopped by the case, the one with the robin suit, the one with his name on it. He never touched it, never opened it, just stood there, staring at the boy he used to be. "You coming?" Bruce would say from the computer, not looking up, and Jason would turn away, following the sound of his voice. "Yeah, just checking the dust." Bruce never called him out on the lie. The Joker was still out there. That was the thing that gnawed at Jason on the bad nights. Not the fact that the clown had killed him. Not the fact that Batman had let him live. But the fact that after everything, after the bomb, after the pit, after all the blood and screaming and second chances, the world still turned. The Joker still laughed. And nothing had really changed. He'd made his peace with it. Mostly. But some wounds never fully closed. Then one night, Oracle's voice crackled over his comm. "Jason, you need to see this." And there it was. Live feed from Arkham. The Joker strapped to a gurney, babbling about angels and gasoline, while the orderlies pumped him full of enough sedatives to drop a rhino. "What happened?" Jason asked, his voice oddly calm. He tried to gas a preschool. Jason didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the screen, His fingers curled into fists so tight his knuckles ached. Then, "Jason, I'm here. You okay?" he exhaled, slow and controlled. "Just thinking." Oracle waited. She was good at that. "He's never going to stop," Jason said at last. Silence. Then, "No, probably not." Jason shut off the feed. That was the cruelest joke of all. The Joker didn't need to die to haunt him. He just had to exist. But life went on. Jason trained. He fought. He saved who he could. And when the nights got too long, when the memories got too loud, he went to the only place that still felt like home. The manor was quiet these days. Alfred was gone. The halls echoed, but the kitchen light was always on, and the tea was always hot. Jason would sit at the table, steaming mug between his hands, and Bruce would pretend not to watch him from the doorway. "You staying?" Bruce would ask, like he did every time, and Jason would shrug like he always did. "Depends. On what? Whether you've got any of those cookies left." Bruce would roll his eyes, but he'd bring the tin. And for a little while, in the glow of the kitchen light, the past didn't matter. The crowbar didn't matter. The bomb didn't matter. There was just this, a father, a son, and the quiet understanding that some failures in the end could still be mended. The rain picked up outside, tapping gently against the windows like fingers on glass. Somewhere in the city, a siren wailed. Somewhere else, a child laughed. Gotham went on, and so did they. The rain fell steady now, a soft hush over Gotham's rooftops, the kind of rain that made the city feel almost peaceful, if you didn't know better. Jason stood on a fire escape, the metal cold under his palms, watching the neon lights blur through the downpour. He wasn't wearing the hood tonight, just a leather jacket, the collar turned up against the damp. No mask, no guns, just a man and his thoughts, and the city that had made him, broken him, and somehow, impossibly, taken him back. He remembered the first time he'd seen Gotham from above. Not as a thief, not as a street rat scrambling over dumpsters, but as Robin. Batman's hand on his shoulder, steadying him as they perched on a gargoyle. The wind had been sharp that night, biting through the thin fabric of his cape. He'd been terrified and exhilarated, and for the first time in his life, he'd felt safe. Funny how things turned out. The alley below was empty now, but he could still see the ghost of himself there, small, furious, swinging a tire iron at the Batmobile, like it had personally wronged him. He hadn't known then what that moment would cost him, what it would give him. If he could go back, would he change it? He'd asked himself that 1,000 times. The answer was always the same. No. Because for all the pain, for all the blood and the screaming and the years spent clawing his way out of his own grave, there had been other moments too. Alfred's patient voice teaching him how to tie a tie. Bruce's rare, gruff praise after a hard-won fight. Dick eventually, grudgingly, showing him how to flip off a rooftop just right. Even now, years later, those memories were the ones that surprised him. Not with their bitterness, but with their warmth. A shadow moved on the rooftop across from him. Jason didn't turn. He didn't need to. "You're getting slow, old man," he said, his breath fogging in the cold air. Batman landed beside him, silent as always. The rain darkened his cape, made it heavier, but he didn't seem to notice. They stood there for a while, shoulder to shoulder, watching the city. "You're not wearing your helmet," Bruce said at last. Jason smirked. "Observant tonight, aren't we?" Bruce didn't rise to the bait, just studied him. That same unreadable look he'd had since Jason was 15. "You're thinking about it again." Jason sighed. There was no point lying. "Yeah," the rain filled the silence between them. Somewhere far below, a car horn blared, then cut off abruptly. "You could come back," Bruce said, so quiet it was almost lost in the downpour. Jason closed his eyes. He'd heard those words before. In the cave, after Ethiopia. In the Bat Cave, years later, when he'd been bleeding out on the floor. And now here, on a rooftop in the rain, like some kind of a recurring dream. "I am back," he said. "Just not the way you want me to be." Bruce didn't argue, just nodded once and turned to go, but then he stopped, reached into his belt, tossed something small and metallic into Jason's hand. A Robin badge, the old one, the one Jason had worn. Jason stared at it. The metal was cool against his palm, the edges worn or smooth from time. He could still remember the weight of it on his chest, the pride. "You kept it," he said. Bruce didn't look back. "I kept all of them." And then he was gone, vanishing into the night like he'd never been there at all. Jason tightened his fingers around the badge. The rain fell harder now, soaking through his hair, running down his face like tears. He should leave, should go back to his safe house, dry off, get some sleep. But for a long time, he didn't move, just stood there, holding on to the past while Gotham breathed around him. Somewhere in the distance, a clock tower chimed. Midnight, another day gone, another day beginning. Jason took a deep breath, let it out slow. Then he pocketed the badge, turned up his collar, and stepped off the fire escape into the dark. The city waited, and so did he. Jason Todd's story is one of Gotham itself, a city that breaks and rebuilds, that scars and heals, that forgets but never truly lets go. After that night on the rooftop, Jason returned to his own path, as he always did. But Gotham has a way of pulling its children back, whether they like it or not. And Jason, for all his anger, his defiance, his insistence that he was no longer Robin, was still Gotham's son. In the years that followed, Jason carved out a space for himself in the shadows of the city. He wasn't Batman, and he wasn't Robin. He was something else entirely, a figure who walked the line between hero and outlaw, between justice and vengeance. He called himself the Red Hood, a name steeped in Gotham's history, a name that had once belonged to the Joker himself. It was a statement, a reminder of what he'd endured, and a challenge to the city that had failed him. But it was also a mask, a way to keep the world at arm's length. Because Jason Todd, for all his bravado, was still a boy who had been hurt too deeply to trust easily. He worked alone mostly. But Gotham is a city of connections, and Jason found himself crossing paths with others who walked the same precarious line. Roy Harper, the archer with a troubled past. Artemis, the Amazon warrior who understood the weight of legacy. Together, they formed the Outlaws, a team of misfits who didn't quite fit anywhere else. It wasn't family, not exactly, but it was something. And for a time, it was enough. Still, Gotham has a way of testing its children, and Jason's path was never smooth. There were moments when the anger flared, when the weight of everything he'd lost threatened to consume him. There were nights when he stood on rooftops, staring down at the city, and wondered if he'd ever be free of it. But there were also moments of clarity, of peace, moments when he remembered why he'd taken up the mantle in the first place, moments when he saw a child in danger, a family in need, and acted without hesitation. Because Jason Todd, for all his flaws, was still a hero at heart. And then there were the nights he crossed paths with Batman. Those encounters were never easy. There was too much history between them, too many wounds that hadn't healed. But there was also something else, a fragile, unspoken understanding. Bruce Wayne had failed Jason Todd, and he knew it. He carried that failure with him every day, in the quiet moments when the weight of the cowl felt heaviest. And Jason knew it too. He knew that Bruce would never stop trying to make amends, in his own stubborn, silent way. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. There was one night in particular that stood out. It was late, the kind of late where even Gotham seemed to hold its breath. Jason was patrolling the docks, keeping an eye on a shipment that didn't feel right. He didn't expect company. But then, he never did. Batman appeared out of the shadows, his cape blending into the night. They didn't speak at first, just stood there, side by side, watching the water ripple under the moonlight. "You're not here to stop me," Jason said finally. It wasn't a question. Bruce shook his head. "No." And that was it. No lecture, no argument. Just a quiet acknowledgement that Jason was his own man now, that he didn't need Bruce's permission to do what he thought was right. It was a small thing, but it meant more than either of them would admit. Over time, Jason found himself drawn back into the fold in ways he hadn't expected. There were missions that required all hands on deck, crises that brought Gotham's protectors together. And Jason, for all his protests, always answered the call. He fought alongside Dick Grayson, the first Robin, who had once been a rival and was now something like a brother. He worked with Tim Drake, the third Robin, who had stepped into the role Jason had left behind. He even crossed paths with Damian Wayne, the youngest Robin, who reminded him a little too much of himself at that age. It wasn't family, not in the traditional sense, but it was something. And for Jason, who had spent so much of his life feeling like he didn't belong, it was enough. There were still arguments, of course. Jason's methods were too harsh, his moral code too flexible for Batman's liking. And Jason, for his part, still resented Bruce for the ways he'd failed him. But there was a rhythm to their relationship now, a give and take that allowed them to coexist. They would never see eye to eye on everything, but they didn't have to, because at the end of the day, they were both fighting for the same thing. A city that had taken so much from them, but had also given them a purpose. Jason's journey wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when the anger and the pain threatened to overwhelm him, but there were also moments of growth, of healing. He learned to forgive, not just others, but himself. He learned to let go of the past, even as it continued to shape him. And he learned that being a hero wasn't about wearing a mask or following a code. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. In time, Jason Todd became more than just Batman's greatest failure. He became a testament to resilience, to the idea that even those who are broken can find a way to rebuild. He was a reminder that Gotham, for all its darkness, is a city of second chances. And he was proof that even the deepest wounds can heal given time. So when Jason Todd stands on a rooftop, staring out at the city that raised him, he doesn't see a failure. He sees a challenge, a promise, a reminder that no matter how many times he falls, he will always get back up, because Gotham is his city, and he is its son. And no matter what comes next, he will face it head on, with all the strength and courage that Gotham has taught him. The rain falls, the city breathes, and Jason Todd moves forward, one step at a time. Because the story of Jason Todd is not a story of endings, it is a story of beginnings, and Gotham, as always, is waiting. And so Jason Todd's story unfolds, not as a single moment or a definitive chapter, but as a slow, winding river that cuts through the heart of Gotham itself. It is a story of contradiction, of light and shadow, of anger and forgiveness, of failure and redemption. And it is a story that cannot be told without first understanding the man who shaped him, the man who both failed him and saved him in ways that neither of them could fully comprehend at the time. Bruce Wayne, the Batman, was a man defined by loss. His parents, taken from him in the blink of an eye, left him with a void that could never truly be filled. And so he became something else, a symbol, a myth, a creature of the night who prowled the streets of Gotham, seeking justice in a city that seemed to thrive on chaos. But even the Batman could not escape the loneliness that came with his mission. And when Dick Grayson, the first Robin, grew up and left the nest to forge his own path, Bruce was left alone, once more. The cave was empty, the mantle of Robin hanging lifelessly on its stand, and the silence was deafening. It was in this silence that Jason Todd entered Bruce's life, though not in the way one might expect. He was not a circus acrobat like Dick, nor was he a boy with a bright future ahead of him. Jason was a street kid, rough around the edges, with a chip on his shoulder, and a survival instinct that had been honed in the harshest corners of Gotham. He was born to Willis Todd and Catherine Todd, a couple whose lives were marked by hardship and struggle. Willis, a small-time criminal, was often absent, leaving Catherine to raise Jason as best she could. But when Catherine died, Jason was left to fend for himself, navigating the treacherous streets of Gotham with nothing but his wits and his fists. It was in Crime Alley, of all places, that Bruce first encountered Jason. The irony was not lost on him, the place where his own life had been shattered, now the birthplace of a new chapter. Jason was stealing the tyres off the Batmobile, a bold and reckless act that spoke volumes about the boy's character. He was quick, resourceful, and unafraid, qualities that caught Bruce's attention. And so, rather than handing him over to the police, Bruce offered Jason a choice: a life of purpose, of training, of becoming something more than just a thief. Jason, with nothing to lose and everything to gain, accepted. As Robin, Jason was different from Dick in almost every way. Where Dick had been graceful and disciplined, Jason was rough and impulsive. He had a sharp tongue and a quicker temper, traits that often led to clashes with Bruce. But he also had a sense of humour, a way of cutting through the darkness with a joke or a sarcastic remark that reminded Bruce of the boy's humanity. Jason's Robin was a reflection of his upbringing, a fighter who understood the streets because he had lived them. He was not afraid to bend the rules, to cross lines that Dick would never have considered. And while this sometimes put him at odds with Bruce, it also made him effective in ways that Dick had never been. But Jason's time as Robin was not without its challenges. The more he worked with Bruce, the more he began to feel the weight of the man's expectations. Bruce was a perfectionist, a man who demanded nothing less than the best from those around him. And Jason, for all his talents, was still a boy trying to find his place in the world. The arguments grew more frequent, the tension more palpable, and yet, beneath it all, there was a bond, a connection that neither of them could fully articulate, but that neither of them could deny. It was this bond that led Jason to seek out his birth mother, a woman named Sheila Haywood. The trail took him out of Gotham, across the world, and eventually to Ethiopia. It was there that Jason's story took its darkest turn. Sheila, desperate and afraid, betrayed her son to the Joker in exchange for her own safety. And so, Jason found himself in a warehouse, facing the man who would become his killer. The details of what happened next are best left unspoken. The crowbar, the bomb, the moments of agony and terror that followed. But when Batman arrived, it was too late. Jason was gone. His life snuffed out in an instant. And Bruce was left to carry the boy's broken body out of the wreckage, a burden that would haunt him for years to come. Back in Gotham, the cave became a tomb. Jason's Robin suit was placed behind glass, a reminder of what had been lost. And Bruce, consumed by guilt and grief, became darker, crueler, more isolated than ever before. The city felt the change, the absence of Robin echoing through the streets like a mournful song. And for a time it seemed as though Jason's story had ended, a tragic footnote in the saga of the Batman. But Gotham is a city of resurrection, a place where the dead do not always stay buried. Years later, Jason returned, though not as the boy he had been. The Lazarus Pit, a mystical pool with the power to restore life, had brought him back. But it had also left him changed, angrier, more volatile, more filled with rage than ever before. He spent years training abroad, honing his skills and biding his time. And when he finally returned to Gotham, it was under a new identity. The Red Hood, a name once used by the Joker himself. As the Red Hood, Jason took control of Gotham's drug trade, using methods far more brutal than Batman's. He killed the men Batman had only ever captured, forcing the city to confront the consequences of its own failures. And he sought out the Joker, demanding answers to the question that had haunted him since his death. Why was the Joker still breathing? The confrontations between Jason and Batman were fraught with tension, each one a reminder of the bond they had once shared and the betrayal that had torn them apart. Black Mask, caught in the middle, became a pawn in their game, a symbol of Gotham's corruption and decay. The final confrontation came in a warehouse, a grim echo of the place where Jason had died. The gun, the crowbar, the choices that neither of them could take back. It was a moment of reckoning, a test of wills that left both men scarred. Batman refused to kill the Joker, a decision that Jason could not understand or accept, and in the end, neither of them won. The rift between them remained, a chasm that could not be bridged. But Jason's story did not end there. In the years that followed, he found a new path, not as Robin, and not as the Red Hood, but as something in between. He formed the Outlaws, a team of misfits who operated outside the law, but still fought for justice. He reconnected with Bruce, though their relationship remained fraught with tension. And he began to heal, not from the wounds of his past, but from the anger that had defined him for so long. Jason Todd's story is not a story of endings. It is a story of beginnings, of a boy who rose from the ashes of Gotham, who found a way to rebuild himself, even when the world seemed determined to tear him down. It is a story of resilience, of the idea that even those who are broken can find a way to move forward. And it is a story of Gotham itself, a city that both creates and destroys, that takes as much as it gives, but that always offers the possibility of redemption. So when Jason Todd stands on a rooftop, staring out at the city that raised him, he does not see a failure. He sees a challenge, a promise, a reminder that no matter how many times he falls, he will always get back up. Because Gotham is his city, and he is its son. And no matter what comes next, he will face it head on, with all the strength and courage that Gotham has taught him. The rain falls, the city breathes, and Jason Todd moves forward, one step at a time. Because the story of Jason Todd is not a story of endings, it is a story of beginnings. And Gotham, as always, is waiting. The rain never stops in Gotham, not truly. It slows sometimes, becomes a mist, a memory of water in the air, but it always returns, just as the shadows always lengthen, just as the city exhales its fog and sighs into the night. Jason Todd knows this rhythm by now, the way the rain sounds on fire escapes, the way it slicks the rooftops, the way it muffles footsteps, but never quite silences them. He has walked these streets in every incarnation of himself, the orphan boy, the reckless Robin, the ghost in the Red Hood, and now something else, something still taking shape. After the blood and the bombs, after the Lazarus Pit's emerald embrace, after the years of fury that burned so hot they nearly consumed him, there is space, a strange, quiet kind of space. Not peace, not exactly, but the absence of war, at least within himself. He still fights, of course. This is Gotham. There is always something to fight, but the edge of the blade is different now. The gun in his hand feels less like revenge and more like a tool. He picks his battles, not because he's softened, but because he understands something now that he couldn't before. Rage is easy. Control is harder. He doesn't live in the manor, not anymore. There are too many ghosts there, too many unspoken words hanging in the air between him and Bruce. Alfred still invites him for tea sometimes, and Jason goes, not out of obligation, but because he wants to. Because Alfred's steady presence is one of the few things that hasn't changed. And because the old man never looks at him like he's a ghost, or a failure, or a mistake. He just looks at him like Jason, and that, more than anything, feels like coming home. The outlaws are different now too. They're not the same ragged band of lost souls they once were. Roy is gone, in a way that still makes Jason's chest ache when he thinks about it for too long. Artemis and Bizarro remain in their own orbits, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always bound to him in ways that defy explanation. They're not family, not exactly, but they're something just as vital. People who chose him, not out of duty or guilt, but because they saw something in him worth following. That's a rare thing in Gotham. Rare anywhere. He crosses paths with the Bat family more often than he used to. Dick, with his easy smile and unshakable optimism, still tries to bridge the gap between them, as if sheer stubbornness alone can mend what was broken. Jason lets him try. Barbara watches him with sharp eyes, weighing his every move, but there's less suspicion there now, more curiosity. Tim, once his replacement, is something like a brother, though neither of them would ever say it out loud. And Damien, well, Damien is Damien, but even the demon brat has stopped looking at him like he's a time bomb waiting to go off. And then there's Bruce, always Bruce, the man who failed him, the man who grieved him, the man who couldn't save him. They don't talk about Ethiopia, they don't talk about the crowbar or the bomb, or the years Jason spent wandering the earth like a revenant. They don't talk about the Red Hood, or the Joker, or the warehouse where they nearly destroyed each other. But they don't have to. The silence between them is its own language. Sometimes late at night, when the city is quiet and the weight of the past feels heavy, Jason finds himself standing in the cave. Not as an intruder, not as a stranger, but as someone who still belongs there, in some small way. The glass case that once held his tattered Robin suit is empty now. Bruce took it down years ago. Jason doesn't know why. He never asked. But he thinks perhaps it was because Bruce finally understood that Jason was never meant to be a relic, never meant to be a memorial. The funny thing is, Gotham never forgot him. Not really. The people in the alleys, the ones who remember the reckless, grinning Robin who used to drop from the sky to help them, still whisper about him. The criminals who face the Red Hood still flinch at the sound of a motorcycle engine. And the ones who knew him as both, the boy who lived and died and lived again, they watch him with something like awe, something like fear, something like hope. Jason doesn't know what comes next. He stopped trying to predict the future a long time ago. Gotham doesn't work that way. It gives and it takes, and sometimes, if you are very lucky, it gives again. He's learned to take the wins where he can find them, a clean shot, a saved life, a night where no one has to die. Small victories maybe, but enough. So when the rain falls, when the neon bleeds into the puddles at his feet, when the city hums with its usual chaos, Jason doesn't ask for more. He doesn't need to. He's already gotten more than anyone ever expected. The boy from Crime Alley, the Robin who died, the Red Hood who rose, he's still here, still standing, still fighting. And if that's not a miracle, Gotham doesn't have any. Jason Todd is a story of resurrection, but not in the way most people think. It's not just about the Lazarus pit, the green waters that dragged him back from death's edge. It's about the slow, stubborn way a life can rebuild itself, piece by broken piece, long after it's been shattered. And it's about Gotham, always Gotham, the city that shaped him, broke him, and then, impossibly, gave him back to himself. After the Red Hood, after the rooftop confrontations, and the gun that was almost fired, after the silence that settled between him and Bruce like a heavy fog, Jason began to drift. Not aimlessly, but carefully, like a man testing the ground beneath his feet after a long fall. He left Gotham for a time, though he always came back. The city was in his blood, its rhythms and shadows, pulse points he couldn't escape. But he needed distance, from Batman, from the memories, from the role he'd been forced to play. First as Robin, then as the Red Hood, and finally as a ghost haunting the edges of Bruce's life. He found purpose, for a time, in the Outlaws, a ragged team of misfits who didn't fit neatly into the world's moral binaries. There was Roy Harper, the archer with his own demons, and Coriander, the alien princess who understood exile better than anyone. Together, they were a strange, broken family, united by their shared sense of being outsiders. Jason liked that. He liked the freedom of it, the way they didn't ask him to be anyone but himself. And for a while, it was enough. But Gotham always called him back. It wasn't just the city itself, the dark alleys, the rain-slick streets, the neon glow of its endless night, but the people in it. The ones he'd once fought to protect, the ones he'd failed, the ones who still remembered him. Not as a symbol or a cautionary tale, but as a boy who'd tried to do the right thing, even when it cost him everything. He returned quietly, without fanfare. The Red Hood became a shadow again, a figure whispered about in the underworld, but rarely seen. He didn't seek out Batman, didn't try to rekindle the fraught, fragile bond they'd once shared. But he didn't hide either. He worked in the margins, taking down the worst of Gotham's predators, the human traffickers, the drug lords, the ones who preyed on the weak and the voiceless. He did it his way, with a gun in his hand and a chip on his shoulder, but also with a strange quiet care that surprised even him. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when he and Bruce crossed paths, not as adversaries, not as allies, but as two men bound by a history too heavy to put into words. They didn't fight, they didn't argue, they simply stood there in the rain or the darkness and acknowledged each other's presence. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was something, a truce perhaps, a fragile, unspoken understanding that they were both still here, still fighting, still trying to make sense of the lives they'd been given. And then there were the others, the ones who'd known him as Robin, the ones who'd grieved him, the ones who didn't know what to make of him now. Dick Grayson, the first Robin, the one who'd set the standard Jason had always struggled to live up to, was wary at first. But over time, he began to see Jason not as a rival or a threat, but as a brother. They didn't talk much about the past. There was too much there, too much pain and regret, but they found common ground in the present, in their shared commitment to protecting Gotham, even if they did it in very different ways. Tim Drake, the Robin who'd followed Jason, was harder to read. He respected Jason, admired his skill and his resilience, but he also feared him. He'd seen what the Red Hood could do, what he was capable of when the lines blurred too much. But even Tim couldn't deny the truth. Jason was family. And in Gotham, family was everything. Barbara Gordon, the Oracle, watched him from afar, her sharp mind always calculating, always analysing. She didn't trust him, not completely, but she didn't distrust him either. She saw him for what he was, a man caught between two worlds, trying to find his place in both. And she respected that. Alfred, of course, was the steady hand, the one who'd never stopped believing in Jason, even when it seemed like no one else did. He didn't push, didn't pry. He simply offered kindness, quiet and unassuming, like a light in the darkness. And Jason, for all his bravado, for all his armour, couldn't help but soften in his presence. The years rolled on, and Jason continued to walk his own path. He wasn't a hero, not in the way Gotham defined heroes. He wasn't a villain either. He was something in between, something harder to pin down. And maybe that was okay, maybe that was enough. There were still moments of anger, of pain, of the old wounds reopening. The Joker was always there, in the back of his mind, a grinning spectre who refused to be exorcised. And Bruce was a constant paradox, a reminder of everything Jason had lost and everything he'd gained. But he didn't let those things define him anymore. He'd learned to live with them, to carry them without letting them crush him. And so when the night falls and the city wakes, Jason Todd, the boy from Crime Alley, the Robin who died, the Red Hood who rose, does what he's always done. He fights. Not for vengeance, not for redemption, but because it's the only thing he knows how to do. He fights for the people who can't fight for themselves. He fights for the city that made him, broke him, and saved him. And he fights for himself, for the boy he was and the man he's become. Because in the end, that's what Batman's greatest failure really means. It's not that Jason died, it's that he lived. And in living, he found a way to be more than a cautionary tale, more than a symbol of loss and regret. He became a testament to resilience, to the indomitable spirit of a boy who refused to stay down, no matter how many times he was knocked to the ground. And so, as the rain falls and the city hums with its endless rhythm, Jason Todd stands on a rooftop, looking out at the skyline he's sworn to protect. He doesn't smile, he doesn't frown. He simply stands there, a shadow against the night, and watches. Because Gotham is his city, his home, and he'll never stop fighting for it. Not as Robin, not as the Red Hood, but as Jason Todd. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. And so the story of Jason Todd persists, not as an ending, but as a quiet undercurrent in the long, dark river of Gotham's history. His is not a legacy marked by statues or plaques. No grand memorials in the heart of the city he once protected. Instead, it lingers in the spaces between, the alleyways where he once ran, the rooftops where he now stands, the unspoken tension in the air when Batman and Red Hood cross paths. There was a time, not long after his return, when Jason believed he could carve out a new kind of justice, one untouched by Bruce's rules. He took the name Red Hood with purpose, a mockery of the clown who had stolen his life, a declaration that fear could be wielded differently. He didn't wear the hood to hide. He wore it so they would see him coming. And for a while, it worked. Criminals whispered his name with the same dread they once reserved for the Bat. He was efficient, brutal, uncompromising. He cut through Gotham's underbelly like a blade, severing the threads that held its corruption together. But the city had a way of twisting even the purest intentions. The more power he seized, the more the darkness seeped in. The line between justice and vengeance blurred. He told himself he was different from the monsters he hunted. But in the quiet moments, alone in safe houses, staring at blood-stained gloves, he wondered. The truth was, he had never wanted to be a killer. He had just wanted the killing to stop. That was the cruel irony of it all. Bruce had failed him, yes, but Jason had failed himself too. Not by dying, not even by coming back wrong, but by believing, even for a second, that the answer was in becoming what he hated. It took time, years really, before he could admit that to himself. The others tried to understand, in their own ways. Dick, who had once been his brother, reached out cautiously, offering not forgiveness because Jason had never asked for it, but the simple acknowledgement that they had both been shaped by the same man, the same war. Tim, the Robin who came after, who had only known Jason as a ghost, surprised him the most. He didn't flinch from the anger, didn't pretend things were fine. He just listened. And in that listening, Jason found something he hadn't realized he needed. The chance to be something other than a cautionary tale. Even Barbara, once wary of him, began to soften. Not because she trusted him, not entirely, but because she saw the way he moved now. Less like a storm, more like a man trying to find his footing. They would never be family, not like before, but they didn't have to be enemies either. And then there was Damien, the newest Robin, the blood son, the boy who had been raised to be a weapon. Jason expected disdain. What he got was something far more complicated. Damien didn't fear him, didn't pity him. He regarded him with the blunt curiosity of a child who had seen too much too young. "You died," Damien said once, matter of fact, "but you're still here. That means you're stronger than the clown." It wasn't kindness, just truth, and for some reason, that meant more. Slowly, reluctantly, Gotham began to make space for him again. Not as Robin, not as the Bat's shadow, but as something undefined. The Red Hood became a fixture, a rogue variable in Gotham's equation. The GCPD didn't trust him, but they didn't shoot on sight anymore. The criminals still feared him, but the innocent, the ones he actually protected, began to whisper gratitude instead of terror. And Bruce was the hardest puzzle of all. They would never see eye to eye. Jason knew that. The no-kill rule wasn't just a line for Bruce, it was the foundation of everything. And Jason had crossed it, would likely cross it again. They would always fight, always argue, always hurt each other. But there were moments, rare and fragile, when something else flickered between them. A glance held too long. A hand on a shoulder after a battle. The unspoken understanding that grief had shaped them both, even if they wore it differently. The cave still held Jason's memorial. The glass case, the uniform, the placard. Bruce had never taken it down, even after Jason returned. At first it felt like a slap, a refusal to accept that he was alive. But as the years passed, Jason began to see it for what it was, a testament, not to the boy who died, but to the man who carried that death with him. He still visited sometimes, not often, but on the bad nights when the memories were too loud, he would descend into the cave, stand before that case, and remember. Not just the pain, but the good things too. The thrill of his first swing across Gotham's skyline, Alfred's patient voice teaching him how to tie a tie, Bruce's rare, quiet praise after a case well solved. Gotham never slept, and neither did its protectors, but there were small reprieves, a shared cup of coffee on a rare quiet night, a reluctant team-up when the threat was too big for grudges. The way the city's skyline looked just before dawn, when the shadows stretched long and the world held its breath. Jason Todd was no hero, but he was no ghost either. He was alive. And in Gotham, that was often the hardest thing to be. So when the nights grow heavy and the streets hum with the distant echoes of sirens, you might catch a glimpse of him, the Red Hood, standing on a rooftop, watching, waiting, not for forgiveness, not for absolution, just for the next fight. Because in the end, that's all any of them could do, keep fighting, keep living. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The rain falls gently now, a quiet lull against Gotham's endless rhythm. The city breathes, the night stretches on, and somewhere in the spaces between shadows, Jason Todd endures, as he always has, as he always will. Gotham's rain is a constant, a murmur that never truly ceases. It falls now soft and steady, as if the city itself is sighing, exhaling the weight of its stories. And in the quiet, Jason Todd moves through the darkness. His presence, a ripple in the fabric of the night. He is not the boy he once was, nor the ghost he became, but something else entirely, something forged in fire and tempered by time. The years after Ethiopia were not kind to him. Even after the Lazarus Pit, even after the training and the rage and the return, there was a hollowness that lingered. A part of him had been left in that warehouse, and no amount of resurrection could bring it back. But Gotham demanded resilience, and Jason, ever the survivor, gave it what it asked for. He carved out a place for himself, not as Robin, not as Batman's protégé, but as something darker, something more dangerous. The Red Hood became more than a name. It became a symbol, a warning, a declaration that the rules of the game had changed. Yet for all his anger, for all his defiance, there were moments when the mask slipped. Moments when he was just Jason again. The boy who stole tires off the Batmobile. The Robin who laughed too loud and fought too hard. Those moments were rare, fleeting, but they were there. In the quiet hours of the morning, when the city was still, and the world felt softer, he would find himself drawn back to the places that shaped him. Crime Alley, with its cracked pavement and flickering streetlights. The rooftops where he first learned to fly. The cave, with its shadows and secrets, and the ghost of a boy he could never quite leave behind. Bruce never spoke of the memorial, but Jason knew it was there, knew it would always be there. It was a reminder not just of what he had lost, but of what Bruce had lost too, of the boy he had failed to save, the son he had buried too soon. And though Jason hated it, hated the way it made him feel, like a ghost, like a mistake, he could not bring himself to destroy it. Because somewhere, deep down, he understood. It wasn't for him. It was for Bruce, for the man who carried his death like a scar, who still saw his face in the shadows of every dark corner. Their relationship was complicated, a tangled web of guilt and grief and love that neither of them knew how to navigate. They fought often and fiercely. They said things they could never take back. But there were times too when they found common ground, when the weight of Gotham pressed down on them both, and they stood shoulder to shoulder against the tide. Those moments were fragile, fleeting, but they were enough. Enough to remind Jason that he was not alone, that he never had been. The outlaws became his family in a way. Roy Harper, with his easy smile and quick wit. Coriander, with her fierce loyalty and boundless compassion. They were broken, all of them, but they were broken together. And for a time that was enough. They fought their battles, saved their corners of the world, and tried to forget the ghosts that haunted them. But Gotham always called him back. Always. No matter how far he ran, how hard he fought, the city was a part of him, as much as the scars on his skin or the memories in his mind. And so he returned time and time again, to Gotham, to Bruce, to the fight that never ended. Because Gotham was not just a city, it was a crucible, a place where heroes were forged and broken and forged again. And Jason Todd, for all his anger, for all his pain, was still a part of that. Still a protector, still a fighter, still a son. The rain falls harder now, a steady rhythm against the rooftops. The city is quiet, but Jason knows it is only a pause, a breath before the next storm. He stands on the edge of a building, the red hood gleaming in the dim light, and watches the streets below. Gotham is eternal, unchanging. It will always need protecting. And Jason Todd, for better or worse, will always answer that call. Because in the end, that's what it means to be Gotham's son. To carry its shadows, its scars, its stories. To fight not because you believe you can win, but because you know you must. And Jason Todd, for all his flaws, for all his failures, has always known that. So the night stretches on, the rain a soft lullaby against the city's endless rhythm, and somewhere in the spaces between shadows, Jason Todd endures, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting, and maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere, in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch. Waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The rain continues to fall, soft and steady, a whisper against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now, the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour. In the monochrome night, he is a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. Before Jason Todd, there was a Gotham that had already tasted loss, Bruce Wayne, the man beneath the cowl, had watched the first Robin, Dick Grayson, grow into his own. Dick had stepped out of the shadow of the Bat, leaving behind the cave and the mantle to forge his own path. For Bruce, it was a bittersweet moment, a reminder that time moves forward, even for those who fight to hold it still. But Gotham does not allow its protectors to rest for long. The city is a wound that never heals, and Bruce found himself alone again, grappling with the weight of his mission. It was in this moment of solitude that Jason Todd entered his life, not as a replacement, but as a spark of hope in the darkness. Jason was a boy of the streets, raised by Gotham's cruel hand. His father, Willis Todd, was a man of broken promises and hollow dreams, and his mother, Catherine, struggled to hold their fragile world together. But even she could not shield Jason from the city's harsh truths. When she passed, Jason was left to fend for himself, a child navigating a world that had no room for innocence. It was in Crime Alley, the same place where Bruce's own story began, that Jason's path crossed with the Bat. He was caught stealing tyres from the Batmobile, a bold act of defiance against a city that had taken so much from him. Bruce saw something in the boy, a fire, a resilience, a mirror of his own younger self. And so, against the warnings of those around him, he brought Jason into the cave, giving him a home, a purpose, and a name. As Robin, Jason Todd was different from his predecessor. Where Dick had been graceful and disciplined, Jason was raw and unpolished, quicker to anger and quicker to laugh. He brought a spark of unpredictability to the role, a reminder that Gotham's heroes were not just symbols, but people shaped by their scars. He was loved by some and mistrusted by others, a boy who wore the mantle of Robin with pride, but carried the weight of his past with every step. But Gotham is a city that tests even the strongest of wills. As the years passed, tension grew between Jason and Bruce. Jason's anger, once a source of strength, became a wedge between them. He questioned Bruce's methods, his refusal to cross certain lines, his inability to truly change Gotham. And Bruce, for all his wisdom, struggled to guide a boy who seemed to slip further from his grasp with each passing day. It was during a mission to find Jason's birth mother that the cracks became too wide to ignore. The trail led them out of Gotham to Ethiopia, where Jason believed he would finally find the answers he sought. But the reunion was short-lived, a cruel twist of fate orchestrated by the Joker. In a secluded warehouse, Jason was confronted with the full measure of Gotham's cruelty. The crowbar, the laughter, the explosion. It was a moment that would haunt Bruce forever. He arrived too late, the warehouse in flames, and carried Jason's body out of the wreckage. Back in the cave, Bruce placed the Robin suit behind glass, a reminder of his greatest failure. Gotham felt the shift in its protector. Batman became harder, crueler, a man who had lost not just a partner, but a son. The city, already steeped in shadows, grew darker still. Years passed and Jason Todd's name became a whisper, a ghost story told in the alleys of Gotham, but ghosts have a way of returning. Through means both miraculous and horrifying, Jason was brought back to life. The Lazarus pit, a place of resurrection and madness, restored his body but left his mind fractured. He awoke wrong, the boy he had been buried beneath layers of rage and pain. He trained abroad, honing his skills, but the anger had nowhere to go. When he returned to Gotham, it was not as Robin, but as the Red Hood. He took the name once used by the Joker, a bitter irony that spoke to his fractured identity. He seized control of the city's drug trade, killing the men Batman only ever caught. The rooftop confrontations were tense, filled with accusations and unspoken grief. Black Mask, caught in the middle, became a pawn in their war. Jason's question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had endured. Why is the Joker still breathing? It was a question Bruce could not answer, not in a way that would satisfy Jason. The final confrontation was inevitable, a clash of ideals and emotions that left neither of them victorious. In the years that followed, Jason's path was uncertain. He formed the Outlaws, a team of misfits who fought on the edges of morality. There were moments when he was family again, standing beside Bruce and Dick, and moments when he was not. The road back was long and uneasy, marked by forgiveness and betrayal, by moments of connection and distance. But what does it mean to be Batman's greatest failure when the boy who died is still standing? Perhaps it means that failure is not the end, but the beginning of something new. Jason Todd, for all his flaws, for all his pain, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He is a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there is a spark of light, a hope that endures. The rain falls softly now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting, and maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain continues to fall, a soft rhythm against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now, the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour in the monochrome night. He's a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. And so the story continues, a tale of loss and redemption, of anger and forgiveness, of a city and its sons. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere, in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain continues to fall, soft and steady, a whisper against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now, the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour in the monochrome night. He is a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. And so the story continues, a tale of loss and redemption, of anger and forgiveness, of a city and its sons. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain continues to fall soft and steady, a whisper against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour in the monochrome night. He is a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. And so the story continues, a tale of loss and redemption, of anger and forgiveness, of a city and its sons. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps as it always does. And somewhere in the shadows Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain continues to fall soft and steady, a whisper against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now, the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour in the monochrome night. He is a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. And so the story continues, a tale of loss and redemption, of anger and forgiveness, of a city and its sons. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere, in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting, and maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain continues to fall soft and steady, a whisper against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now, the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour in the monochrome night. He is a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. And so the story continues, a tale of loss and redemption, of anger and forgiveness, of a city and its sons. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace, not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting, and maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain continues to fall soft and steady, a whisper against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now, the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour in the monochrome night. He is a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. And so the story continues, a tale of loss and redemption, of anger and forgiveness, of a city and its sons. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain continues to fall, soft and steady, a whisper against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now, the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour in the monochrome night. He is a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. And so the story continues, a tale of loss and redemption, of anger and forgiveness, of a city and its sons. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting, and maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain continues to fall soft and steady, a whisper against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now, the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour in the monochrome night. He is a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. And so the story continues, a tale of loss and redemption, of anger and forgiveness, of a city and its sons. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting, and maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rain continues to fall soft and steady, a whisper against the rooftops and alleys of Gotham. It is a city that never truly rests, its streets alive with the hum of neon and the echo of footsteps. But for now the chaos is quiet, and the city breathes in the stillness. Jason Todd stands alone, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, the red of his helmet a flicker of colour in the monochrome night. He is a figure caught between worlds, between the boy he was and the man he has become, between the shadows of Gotham and the light he once sought to protect. And so, the story continues, a tale of loss and redemption, of anger and forgiveness, of a city and its sons. The rain falls gently now, a quiet murmur against the city's endless hum. The night stretches on, and Gotham sleeps, as it always does. And somewhere in the shadows, Jason Todd stands watch, waiting, watching, enduring, as he always has, as he always will. The city breathes, and so does he. Gotham is eternal, and so is he. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the spaces between heartbeats, he finds his peace. Not in forgiveness, not in absolution, but in the knowledge that he is alive, that he is here, that he is still fighting, and